My grandparents died. I inherited $26 million. My parents demanded it. When I refused, I was a kindergarten teacher living on boxed mac and cheese paydays when a single phone call changed my life. It came on a Tuesday during nap time. The classroom was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the gentle breathing of 20 small children. I was sitting at my desk, cutting out construction paper leaves for an autumn collage. My world was small, predictable, and safe. It was a world of scraped knees, juice boxes, and the smell of crayons. I liked it that way. The phone vibrated against a stack of coloring books. It was an unknown number, and I almost ignored it. But something made me pick it up. A man's voice, low and somber, asked if I was Anna Grace Foster. When I said yes, he told me my grandparents were gone. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. The words didn't make sense. Gone? Gone where? My mind couldn't form the right questions. He said there had been an accident. A car crash. He was a lawyer, their lawyer, and he was sorry. I remember hanging up the phone and just staring at the half-cut paper leaf in my hand. It was a perfect, jagged maple. Nothing in my world felt perfect anymore. The funeral was a blur of black suits and hushed apologies. My parents, Richard and Diane, stood at the front, accepting condolences like they were accepting awards. My father's face was a mask of dignified grief. My mother dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. I stood beside them, feeling like a ghost. These were the people who raised me, but I didn't know them at all. The only real parents I ever had were lying in 2 polished wooden caskets. 2 weeks later, we were sitting in the lawyer's office for the will reading. The room was just as stiff and formal as my parents'. It was on the top floor of a glass building downtown, with a view of the entire city. The chairs were plush leather that squeaked with every small movement. The air smelled of old paper and expensive cologne. My father sat back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other. He looked confident, like a man who knew what was coming and was pleased with it. My mother sat beside him, her back perfectly straight. Her nails, painted a deep blood red, tapped a silent rhythm on her leather purse. My brother, Jason, who was 2 years older than me, wasn't even pretending to pay attention. His eyes were glued to his phone, his thumb scrolling endlessly. They were all waiting for their reward for being the children of Harold and Elizabeth Foster. I just felt numb. I didn't want a reward. I wanted my grandmother's warm hugs. I wanted to hear my grandfather's booming laugh one more time. I wanted to sit with them on their porch swing, drinking iced tea and watching the fireflies come out. I wanted the only love I had ever truly known back. The lawyer, Mr. Goldstein, was an older man with kind eyes that seemed out of place in this cold room. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He read through some legal terms that went right over my head. I heard phrases like last will and testament and of sound mind and body. My father nodded along, as if he'd written the script himself. Then Mr. Goldstein paused. He looked up from the papers, his eyes finding mine across the wide mahogany desk. For a split second, I saw pity in his gaze. "And now," he said, his voice steady and clear, "we come to the disposition of the primary assets, including all shares of Foster Logistics, the family properties, and all liquid accounts, totaling an estimated $26 million. A quiet tension filled the room. This was the main event. My mother's hand stopped tapping. Jason finally looked up from his phone. My father leaned forward just a fraction of an inch. Mr. Goldstein took a deep breath. Per the final wishes of Harold and Elizabeth Foster, their entire estate is to be left to one individual. He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he said the sentence that shattered everything. Anna Grace Foster is the sole beneficiary. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. It was a thick, heavy silence, filled with shock and disbelief. I felt the air leave my lungs. Me? It had to be a mistake. I was a kindergarten teacher. I worried about paying my rent and whether I had enough gas in my car to make it to the end of the week. What would I do with $26 million? My father's jaw locked. The confident smile he had been wearing moments before vanished, replaced by a tight, ugly line. I saw a vein throbbing in his temple. My mother's nails, which had been tapping, were now digging so hard into the leather of her purse that I was sure she would leave marks. "What did you say?" my father asked. His voice was dangerously low. Mr. Goldstein didn't flinch. "The will is perfectly clear, Richard. Everything goes to Anna." "That's impossible," my mother hissed, her practiced sympathy gone. They were senile. They didn't know what they were doing. "On the contrary," Mr. Goldstein said calmly, "they were of perfectly sound mind." They also recorded a video message to be played at this reading, explaining their decision. He turned his laptop around. My heart hammered against my ribs. I should have been grieving. I should have been crying for the grandparents I had lost. Instead, I was sitting in a room with 3 people who were looking at me as if I had stolen something from them. I was about to learn a lesson that no school could ever teach: how money, or the lack of it, could make blood turn poisonous. And this was only the beginning. To understand why my grandparents did what they did, you have to understand the family I grew up in. I was born and raised in Ohio, in a big, beautiful house in a neighborhood where the lawns were always perfectly green and the cars were always new. From the outside, we were the perfect family. Richard and Diane Foster, their successful son, Jason, and their quiet daughter, Anna. But inside that house, I was emotionally invisible. My parents, Richard and Diane, chased luxury, not love. Their lives were a performance. Every dinner party, every holiday, every family gathering was a chance to show off their wealth and their status. My father was a real estate developer who built soulless McMansions on cleared-out farmland. My mother's job was to be the perfect wife. She organized charity galas, played tennis at the country club, and made sure our family looked flawless to the outside world. Affection in our house wasn't a hug or a kind word. It was a transaction. It was my mother saying, "Wear this dress to the Hendersons' party, Anna, and don't spill anything." It was my father telling me, "Straight A's look good on college applications. Don't disappoint me." Love was conditional. It was something to be earned through obedience and performance. My brother, Jason, learned how to play the game early. He was a natural. He was charming, athletic, and knew how to say all the right things. He was the golden child, the one my parents paraded around. He was going to take over my father's business one day. He was their legacy. I was just there, the quiet girl who preferred books to parties. The afterthought family dinners weren't about sharing your day. They were lectures on appearances. "Jason, your golf swing is improving." The chairman of the bank was very impressed, my father would say. Or my mother would chime in, "Diane, I saw Carol Ann today. Her daughter just got accepted into Yale. You need to work harder on your SAT prep, Anna." I would just sit there, pushing my food around my plate, feeling my throat tighten. I learned to be quiet. I learned to be small. It was easier that way. The only place I ever felt seen was with my grandparents, Harold and Elizabeth. They were the complete opposite of my parents. They lived 30 minutes away, in the same small, modest house they had bought 50 years ago. They owned a trucking business, Foster Logistics, which they had built from scratch in the 1970s with one truck and a whole lot of grit. That business was the source of my parents' comfortable life, a fact they preferred to ignore. My father was embarrassed by them. He mocked my grandfather's old pickup truck and my grandmother's thrift store clothes. "They're sitting on a gold mine and they live like paupers," he'd complain after every forced holiday visit. It's embarrassing, but I loved their world. Their house smelled like coffee and sawdust. My grandmother taught me how to garden, how to feel the soil between my fingers and coax life from a tiny seed. She taught me how to bake bread, how to mend a torn shirt, and how to be kind. My grandfather taught me how to change the oil in a car and the importance of a firm handshake. He taught me about frugality, not as something to be ashamed of, but as a sign of respect for hard work. "Never waste a dollar you've earned, Annie girl," he'd say, ruffling my hair. And never look down on a person willing to get their hands dirty. While my parents were at the country club, I was at my grandparents' house. I spent my summers there, helping my grandmother in her garden, listening to my grandfather's stories about the early days of the business. He would tell me about driving all night to make a delivery, about sleeping in his truck, about the deals he made on a handshake that were more binding than any contract. He taught me what humility and integrity looked like. When it was time for me to go to college, my parents wanted me to major in business or law, something prestigious, something that would look good. I told them I wanted to be a teacher. The look on my mother's face was a mixture of horror and disappointment. "A teacher?" she said, the word tasting like something sour in her mouth. "Anna, be serious. That's a hobby for women who marry rich, not a career." My father was even more blunt. "We're not paying for a degree in finger painting," he said. "If you want to waste your life, you can do it on your own dime." It was my grandparents who paid for my education. They didn't even hesitate. "The world needs good teachers, Annie girl," my grandfather said when I told them. "There's no nobler profession." My grandmother hugged me and whispered, "We are so proud of you." It was the first time anyone in my family had said those words to me, so I became a teacher. I got a small apartment, furnished it with secondhand finds, and filled my life with the messy, chaotic, beautiful world of 5-year-olds. It wasn't a glamorous life. It didn't impress my parents' friends, but it was mine. It was real. My parents rarely called. When they did, it was to ask me to show up for a family photo or a holiday dinner where I was expected to sit quietly and not embarrass them. They never once asked about my students or my classroom. They had no interest in the life I had built for myself. To them, I was a failure, a disappointment. But every Sunday, without fail, I drove to my grandparents' house for dinner. We'd eat my grandmother's pot roast and talk for hours. They were my rock. They were my home. They were the ones who chose me every single day, and I chose them. I had no idea that their choice, their love, would one day become a weapon my own parents would use against me. When Mr. Goldstein told me my grandparents had died in a car crash, my world didn't just crack. It caved in. The first few days were a thick fog of disbelief and a pain so deep it felt like it was in my bones. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I would just sit in my quiet apartment, staring at the wall, the silence screaming with all the things I would never get to say to them again. No more Sunday dinners. No more of my grandfather's terrible jokes. No more of my grandmother's advice. The funeral was a performance, and my parents were the lead actors. My mother, dressed in an expensive black dress, clutched a handkerchief and produced tears at all the right moments. My father stood stoic and grim, accepting handshakes and murmurs of, "So sorry for your loss," with a practiced solemnity. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't seen in years suddenly appeared, their faces etched with a grief that felt hollow and insincere. They talked about how wonderful Harold and Elizabeth were, but they were talking about strangers. They didn't know the real people. They didn't know the woman who hummed off-key while she weeded her tomatoes, or the man who cried every time he watched It's a Wonderful Life. I felt a cold rage bubble up inside me. Where were all these people when my grandparents were alive? Where were they for the last 10 birthdays my grandfather celebrated? They hadn't visited in years, but they showed up for the free food and the drama. I stood through the entire service feeling completely and utterly alone. My own parents didn't even look at me. My brother Jason spent most of the time outside, talking on his phone about some business deal. In a church full of people, I was invisible. 2 weeks passed in that same gray fog. Then came the will reading. As I sat in that leather chair in Mr. Goldstein's office, the fog began to clear, replaced by a sharp, cold dread. I watched my family. My father leaned back, confident, already spending the money in his head. My mother rehearsed the sympathetic smiles she would give when her husband inherited the family fortune. Jason was bored, already assured of his cut. They saw this as a finish line, the end of their obligation to the old folks, and the beginning of their reward. Then the lawyer announced the inheritance. Every dollar, every property, every share of Foster Logistics went to me. The shock in the room was electric. My father's confidence shattered like glass. He surged forward in his chair. "That's a lie," he snapped, his voice cracking. "There must be some mistake. Let me see that paper." Mr. Goldstein slid the document across the desk. "There's no mistake, Richard." My father's eyes scanned the page, his face turning a dark, blotchy red. My mother was the next to speak, her voice sharp and brittle. "This is ridiculous. It's senile favoritism. A teacher can't handle that kind of money. She'll lose it all in a year." "They had their reasons," Mr. Goldstein said, his calm demeanor infuriating them even more. "And they wanted to explain them to you themselves." He turned his laptop toward us and pressed play. Suddenly, my grandparents were there, sitting on their familiar floral sofa. My grandfather had his arm around my grandmother. They looked older, more tired than I remembered, but their eyes were clear. My grandmother smiled, a sad, gentle smile that made my heart ache. "Hello, everyone," my grandfather began, his voice as steady as ever. "If you're watching this, it means we're gone. We hope it was quick, and we hope we didn't leave too big of a mess." He paused and looked at my grandmother, who squeezed his hand. She looked directly into the camera, and it felt like she was looking right at me. "We know our final decision might be a shock to some of you," she said softly. "Especially to you, Richard and Diane. We love you. You are our children. But love and trust are two different things." My father made a noise in the back of his throat, a strangled sound of outrage. My grandfather continued. "For 40 years, we built a business and a life on the principles of hard work, honesty, and looking out for folks who need a hand up. We've watched our children, and we've watched our grandchildren. We've seen who values things and who values people." His eyes seemed to harden just a little. "Richard, we have given you so much over the years. We helped you start your business. We paid for your home, but it was never enough. It was always about more." My grandmother took over. "And Anna," she said, her voice softening. My breath caught in my throat. "Our sweet Anna, you never asked us for a thing. You just gave us your time, your love. You sat with us. You listened to our stories. You remembered our birthdays." Tears started to well in her eyes. "You were the only one who came to see us without asking for something. You've earned our trust and our legacy." My grandfather gave a final, firm nod. The business, the money, it's not a prize. It's a responsibility. And we are trusting it to the only person we know will handle it with a good heart and a steady hand. We trust Anna to carry on what we started. The video ended. The screen went black. That single line, "You were the only one who came to see us without asking for something," hung in the air, an indictment of everyone else in the room. It was the truth, and the truth had just set fire to everything. My father stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. His face was a mask of pure fury. He pointed a shaking finger, not at the screen, but at me. "You," he spat. "You manipulated them. You poisoned them against their own family," the room erupted. My mother was on her feet, yelling about lawyers and contesting the will. Jason was swearing under his breath, staring at me with a look of utter contempt. But I barely heard them. All I could hear was my grandmother's voice. All I could see was my grandfather's proud face. They hadn't forgotten me. They saw me. They had always seen me. And in their final act on this earth, they made sure the whole world knew it. The ride home from the lawyer's office was silent and heavy. I drove my own beat-up sedan, following my parents' gleaming black luxury car. I could feel their anger radiating through the glass and steel, a toxic cloud that followed me all the way back to their pristine, oversized house. I didn't want to go. I wanted to drive to my own little apartment and hide under the covers. But a text from my mother had pinged on my phone before we even left the parking garage. "We need to talk. At the house. Now." It wasn't a request. They summoned me to the formal living room, a place we only ever used for important guests. It was a cold, sterile room full of white furniture and abstract art. It felt more like a museum than a home. I sat on the edge of a stiff white sofa, my hands clenched in my lap. My father paced back and forth in front of the unlit fireplace. My mother sat opposite me, her face a carefully composed mask of disappointment. Jason leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, looking like my father's loyal soldier. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The only sound was the clicking of my father's expensive shoes on the hardwood floor. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to face me. His eyes were like chips of ice. "This is a mess, Anna," he began, his voice dangerously calm. "A complete and utter mess that you have helped create." I opened my mouth to speak, to say that I hadn't done anything, but he held up a hand to silence me. "My parents were old," he continued. "They were clearly not in their right minds. They were susceptible to influence." He looked me up and down, his gaze full of disdain. "And you were there every Sunday, weren't you?" Filling their heads with nonsense. "I was there because I loved them," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My mother scoffed. "Love," she said, as if the word were ridiculous. "Anna, this is about business. It's about the family legacy. You can't possibly understand the complexities of managing an estate of this size." She gestured to the polished coffee table between us. On it was a thick stack of papers, neatly bound. "Your father and I have already spoken to our lawyers. We've had these drawn up to fix the situation." I stared at the documents. "What are they?" "It's a simple transfer of administrative control," my father said smoothly, stepping in. "We will manage the estate. It's for the best. It protects the assets from being mishandled. We've set it up to avoid massive tax implications. It's the smart, responsible thing to do." My mother gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're not trying to take anything from you, dear. We've allocated a generous portion for you, 10%. It's more money than you'll ever know what to do with. It will save this family from the embarrassment of having a kindergarten teacher run a multi-million-dollar corporation into the ground. 10%. They were offering me 10% of what my grandparents had left for me, as if they were doing me a favor. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't about protecting the family. This was about control. This was about greed. I hesitated. My mind was spinning. Everything was happening so fast. My grandparents' video message played in my head. "We trust Anna." They had trusted me, not them. My hesitation was all the answer they needed. Jason, who had been silent until now, pushed himself off the doorframe and slammed his hand down on the table. The sound echoed in the silent room. "Just sign the papers, Anna," he yelled, his face red with anger. "You owe us. Who paid for your first car? Who let you live rent-free for a year after college? Mom and Dad. Without them, you wouldn't even have that crappy little apartment you live in. You owe them this." The injustice of it all stung me. They hadn't paid for my car. My grandparents had. The apartment I lived in was mine, paid for with the salary I earned. They had done nothing for me, not really. They had only ever demanded. My father leaned in, his face just inches from mine. His voice was as cold as marble. "He's right. We have given you everything. Now we are asking for this one thing. You will sign these papers, Anna. You will do the right thing and return what is rightfully ours." He paused, letting his words sink in. He thought he had me backed into a corner. He thought the little quiet girl would do what she was told, just like she always had. "Sign this, Anna," he said, his voice dropping to a low threat. "Or you're no longer part of this family." The words hit me like a physical blow. No longer part of this family. For a moment, panic seized me. The threat of being completely cut off, of being utterly alone, was terrifying. My entire life I had craved their approval, their love, and even the smallest crumb of it felt better than nothing. But then, I thought of my grandparents. I thought of their unwavering love, their trust. They had given me more than money. They had given me a backbone. They had shown me what a real family was. A real family didn't issue ultimatums. A real family didn't threaten to abandon you. I looked at my father, then my mother, then my brother. I saw them for who they truly were. Not family, but strangers who shared my blood. My voice shook, but only once when I started to speak. No, the word was quiet, but it landed in the center of the room like a stone. My father's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" I took a deep breath and found a strength I never knew I possessed. I stood up so I was no longer looking up at them. I said, "No, I'm not signing anything." I looked my father directly in the eye. Grandma and Grandpa trusted me. "I'm not going to betray them." I saw a flash of disbelief, then pure rage in his eyes. He had pushed what he thought was his final chess piece, and it had refused to move. He repeated his threat, his voice a low growl. "You walk out that door without signing and you are dead to us. Do you understand me? You will have nothing. No one." The fear was still there, a cold whisper in the back of my mind. But my grandparents' love was louder. I looked at the three of them, at their cold, angry faces, and I made my choice. Then, I guess I'm not part of this family. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the papers, the money, and the people who were supposed to love me behind. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in my life, I felt free. I thought my father's threat was just that, a threat. Angry words spoken in a moment of fury. I thought I would have time to figure things out, to find a new place to live, to make a plan. I was wrong. I had underestimated their cruelty. Within an hour of me walking out of their house, they proved how real the threat was. I was sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. "I suggest you pack your things." A second text followed immediately after. It was a formal-looking document, a PDF file. "As the owner of the building at 1254 Maple Street, I am hereby terminating your month-to-month lease, effective immediately." I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. My apartment building. He owned my apartment building. I scrolled through my rental agreement, a document I hadn't looked at since I signed it. The owner was listed as a corporation, R&D Properties LLC, Richard and Diane. Of course, it was one of his shell companies. All this time, I had been paying rent to my own father, and I never even knew it. It was another one of his games, another way to hold power over me. My phone rang. It was my mother. I answered, my voice a choked whisper. "What do you want?" "We're being generous, Anna," she said, her voice completely devoid of any warmth. "We're giving you until midnight." "Pack quickly." The locks change at midnight. The line went dead. Generous. They were kicking me out onto the street with less than 3 hours' notice, and she called it generous. A sob escaped my lips, a raw, ragged sound. I drove back to my apartment in a daze, the world outside my windshield a blurry mess of lights and colors. When I got to my building, a security guard I had never seen before was standing by the front door. He had a list. My name was on it. "You have until midnight to vacate the premises," he said in a monotone voice, refusing to meet my eyes. My apartment, my safe little haven, suddenly felt like a prison. The clock was ticking. I ran inside and grabbed cardboard boxes from the recycling bin in the hallway. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely tape them together. What do you pack when your life has been dismantled in a single evening? I started in my bedroom. I threw clothes into a suitcase. Not the fancy dresses my mother had bought me for Christmases, the ones that never felt like me. I packed my comfortable jeans, my soft sweaters, the t-shirts I wore to school. I grabbed the shoebox from the top of my closet. Inside were all the cards and letters my grandparents had ever sent me. Every birthday, every holiday, every simple thinking of you note. They were more valuable to me than anything. In the living room, I looked around at the life I had built. My books, my little collection of mismatched mugs, the finger paintings my students had made for me, taped to the refrigerator. I couldn't take it all. There wasn't time. I grabbed a few of my favorite books and the framed photo of my grandparents that sat on my nightstand. The last thing I took was my grandmother's quilt. It lay folded at the end of my bed. She had made it for me when I went to college. It was a patchwork of old fabrics, scraps from her aprons, my grandfather's old work shirts, even a piece of my baby blanket. It smelled like her. It smelled like home. I wrapped it around myself, the heavy fabric a small comfort against the crushing weight of my new reality. I managed to fill my car with 3 bags, 2 boxes, and the quilt. It was a pathetic summary of my 27 years. As I carried my last box out, my parents' car pulled up to the curb. My father got out. He didn't come to help. He came to watch. He stood there on the sidewalk, his arms crossed, his face unreadable in the dim glow of the streetlights. "I hope it was worth it," he said, his voice laced with venom. I just stared at him, my heart a shattered mess in my chest. I couldn't find any words. What could I possibly say to him? As I walked past him to my car, he leaned in and hissed the cruelest words I had ever heard. "You were an accident, you know. Your mother and I were happy before you came along. You were an accident that ruined our lives." The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. All the little moments of neglect, all the times I felt invisible, all the dismissive comments, they all clicked into place. It wasn't just that they preferred Jason, it was that they had never wanted me at all. I stumbled, catching myself on the car door. I didn't look back at him. I couldn't. I got into my car, the quilt still wrapped around my shoulders, and drove away. Tears streamed down my face, hot and blinding. I drove into the night with no destination, sobbing, an orphan with living parents. I had lost my home, my family, and the very foundation of who I thought I was. All I had left was a car full of boxes and a single key clutched in my hand, the key to my grandparents' house, the one Mr. Goldstein had given me. It felt heavy in my palm, a tiny piece of metal that held the weight of my past and the terrifying uncertainty of my future. It was the only key I had left. I drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. The city lights blurred into long streaks of red and gold through my tear-filled eyes. I had no destination, no plan. I was just running. Every time I blinked, I saw my father's face twisted with contempt. I heard his words over and over again. "You were an accident that ruined our lives." An accident. A mistake. The explanation for a lifetime of feeling like I was on the outside looking in. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The sobs came in waves, deep, ragged gasps that left me feeling empty and raw. I was homeless. I was, for all intents and purposes, an orphan. The world felt vast and terrifyingly empty. Then my fingers brushed against the key in my pocket. It was cold and solid. The key to my grandparents' house. A tiny spark of something, not quite hope, but a direction, flickered within me. I changed lanes and headed out of the city, toward the one place on earth I had always felt safe. Their house was on a quiet street in a small town where everyone knew their neighbors. It was a simple 2-story home with a wide front porch and a big oak tree in the yard. It wasn't grand or impressive like my parents' house, but it was real. It was loved. I parked my car in the driveway and just sat there for a long time, looking at the dark windows. The thought of going inside without them there felt like a betrayal. It was their space. But the alternative was sleeping in my car. Taking a shaky breath, I got out and walked up the familiar stone path. My hand trembled as I put the key in the lock. It turned smoothly. The moment I pushed the door open, the air smelled like them. It was a comforting mix of my grandmother's lemon polish and the faint scent of cedar from my grandfather's workshop, the scent of safety. I stepped inside and closed the door, shutting out the cold, dark night. For the first time all evening, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't turn on the lights. I let my eyes adjust to the darkness, navigating by memory. I walked through the living room, my fingers trailing over the soft, worn fabric of my grandfather's favorite armchair. I saw the faint indentation where he always sat. I moved into the kitchen and stood in the spot where my grandmother and I had baked countless batches of cookies, the floorboards creaking in the same familiar way. Every object held a memory. The cuckoo clock on the wall that my grandfather refused to get rid of, the stack of old National Geographic magazines on the coffee table, the chipped mug by the sink that said "World's Best Grandpa." This wasn't just a house. It was a museum of my childhood, a testament to the only unconditional love I had ever known. A fresh wave of grief washed over me, but this time it was different. It wasn't the panicked, frantic grief from before. It was a deep, sorrowful ache for the 2 wonderful people I had lost. I sank onto their sofa, pulled my grandmother's quilt tighter around me, and cried until I had no tears left. I must have fallen asleep because I was startled awake by a soft knocking at the front door. Sunlight was streaming through the windows. It was morning. My whole body was stiff and my head pounded. For a terrifying second, I thought my parents had found me. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Mr. Goldstein, the lawyer. He was holding a cardboard tray with 2 cups of coffee and a small paper bag. The relief was so overwhelming my knees felt weak. I opened the door. He gave me a kind, sad smile. "I thought you might end up here," he said gently. "May I come in?" I nodded, unable to speak. He stepped inside and placed the coffee on the kitchen table. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries from the bag filled the air. It was such a normal human gesture that it almost made me cry again. "I called your cell phone a few times last night," he said, his voice full of concern. "When you didn't answer, I got worried. I suspected Richard might pull something like this. He kicked me out," I said, my voice hoarse. "He owns my apartment building. He gave me until midnight to leave." Mr. Goldstein's expression hardened. He shook his head slowly. "I'm so sorry, Anna. They've left you no choice." He pulled out a chair from the table. "Please sit down. We have a lot to talk about. Your grandparents? They were very wise. They saw this coming." He opened the leather briefcase he had brought with him and took out a large, worn folder. He laid it on the table between us. "Your grandparents started preparing this over 5 years ago. They knew who Richard was. They knew what he was capable of." He opened the folder. It was filled with documents, journals, and letters. It was a meticulously organized archive of my parents' greed. "They documented everything," Matthew said, his voice calm and steady. "Every time your father asked for a loan and didn't pay it back. Every time your mother complained about their frugal lifestyle while demanding money for a new car or a country club membership." He slid a small leather-bound book toward me. It was my grandmother's journal. Her elegant looping cursive filled the pages. I opened it to a bookmarked page. October 12th, it read, "Richard called again today. He needs another $50,000 for a new real estate venture. He says it's a sure thing, just like the last one. When Harold told him we needed to think about it, he became so angry. He said we owed it to him, that our money was doing nothing sitting in a bank. It breaks my heart to hear him talk that way. He doesn't see us as his parents anymore. He sees us as a vault he can't quite crack open." My throat closed up. I looked through more documents. There were copies of checks written to my father, labeled loan, with no record of repayment. There were letters from my mother detailing her extravagant spending habits. Then, Matthew slid a small flash drive across the table. "This is the most crucial part," he said grimly. "Your grandparents installed a new security system last year. It had cameras covering the main rooms, the entrances, and the safe where they kept my grandmother's jewelry." He opened his laptop and inserted the drive. "They suspected your parents might try something after they were gone. This footage is from the day after the funeral." He clicked play. An image of my grandparents' living room appeared on the screen. It was empty. Then, the front door opened, and my parents walked in. They looked around, making sure no one was there. My mother walked straight to a landscape painting on the wall, took it down, and opened the small safe hidden behind it. I watched in horror as my own mother, dressed in her black funeral attire, began pocketing my grandmother's jewelry, a pearl necklace, diamond earrings, brooches that I remembered her wearing. My father stood guard by the window. "They're thieves," I whispered, a sick feeling rising in my stomach. "They came here after burying their own parents and stole from them." "Your grandparents anticipated this," Matthew repeated softly. "They knew they had to protect you. They knew they had to leave you more than just money. They had to leave you the truth and the tools to defend it." He closed the laptop and looked at me, his eyes full of compassion. "You are not alone in this, Anna. They made sure of that." I sat there, in the quiet warmth of my grandparents' kitchen, the smell of coffee in the air. The shock and grief were still there, but they were now mixed with something else. A flicker of strength, a sense of purpose. My parents had exiled me and left me with nothing, but my grandparents had left me a plan. They had left me a shield. They had left me everything I needed to fight back. I woke up the next morning in the guest room, the one with the pale yellow walls and the faint scent of lavender. For a split second, I forgot everything. I thought I was a teenager again, having a sleepover at Grandma and Grandpa's. Then the weight of the last 48 hours crashed down on me. The will reading, the ultimatum, the eviction, the video of my parents stealing jewelry, but instead of the crushing despair of the day before, I felt a new, unfamiliar resolve hardening in my chest. I was no longer just a victim of their cruelty. I was the guardian of my grandparents' legacy, and I would not let them down. I went downstairs. Matthew Goldstein was already in the kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing. He had stayed in the other guest room, unwilling to leave me alone. He nodded at me with a reassuring smile. Morning, Anna. I took the liberty of making some calls. Some people are coming over today. People your grandparents trusted. People you can trust. Before I could ask who, the doorbell rang. It was a man in his late 50s, his face weathered and kind, his hands calloused from years of work. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans. I recognized him instantly. Carlos, I said, a small smile touching my lips. Carlos had been my grandparents' handyman for as long as I could remember. He could fix anything, from a leaky faucet to a car engine. He took off his worn baseball cap and held it in his hands. "Miss Anna," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry about your grandparents. They were the best people I ever knew." He looked past me to Matthew. "Mr. Goldstein called. He said you needed me." "Thank you for coming, Carlos," Matthew said, shaking his hand. "Please come in." An hour later, the doorbell rang again. This time it was Dorothy, my grandmother's housekeeper and friend for over 30 years. She was a small, round woman with a fiery spirit and a heart of gold. The moment she saw me, she enveloped me in a hug that smelled like clean laundry and comfort. "Oh, you poor thing," she clucked, holding me at arm's length to look at my face. "I heard what those two monsters did, kicking their own daughter out on the street. Your grandmother would be spinning in her grave." She marched into the kitchen like she owned the place, which, in a way, she did. "Matthew, you put that coffee on, but did you think to make this child some breakfast?" Men. Soon after, two more people arrived. Rosa Martinez, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman who was my grandfather's business partner and the co-owner of Foster Logistics. She had a no-nonsense air about her, but her eyes held a deep respect and sadness. The last to arrive was George Patel, my grandparents' financial advisor, a calm, meticulous man who carried a thick briefcase full of spreadsheets and financial reports. We all gathered around the big oak table in the kitchen. It felt strange at first, this odd collection of people, but as they started talking, I realized we were all connected by the two people who were no longer with us. We were a family of sorts, a family bound by love and loyalty to Harold and Elizabeth Foster. Matthew started, laying out the situation clearly and concisely. He told them about the will, my parents' reaction, and the evidence my grandparents had collected. Then, he turned the floor over to the others. Each one came bearing their own piece of the truth, their own proof of my grandparents' foresight. Carlos spoke first. "About a year ago," he said, his voice low, "I was fixing the gutters right outside Mr. Foster's office window. He didn't know I was there. I heard him on the phone with your father, Richard. They were yelling. Richard was demanding money, said his business was in trouble. Mr. Foster told him he had given him enough, that he had to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. And then Richard said something awful." Carlos looked down at his hands. He said, "You're just a stingy old man. I can't wait until you're gone so I can finally get what I deserve." A collective gasp went through the room. Dorothy was next. She placed a small, cloth-bound journal on the table. "Your grandmother gave this to me a few months ago. She said if anything ever happened to her, and if Richard and Diane started causing trouble for you, I was to give this to you." It was another one of my grandmother's journals. This one chronicled my Aunt Pamela's manipulations. My father's sister was just as greedy as he was. The journal detailed years of Pamela crying poverty, begging for money for her children's private school or a new car, all while going on expensive vacations that my grandmother saw pictures of on social media. There were photocopies of emails between Pamela and my father, conspiring on how to get more money out of their out-of-touch parents. Then Rosa Martinez opened her briefcase. "Harold was more than my business partner. He was my mentor," she said, her voice firm. "He knew Richard had been trying to undermine him for years. This," she slid a file across the table, "is a record of a $200,000 loan Harold gave Richard 5 years ago to cover a massive business debt. It was never repaid. Richard has been hiding it from his own company's books ever since. If his investors knew, he would be ruined." Finally, George Patel laid out the financial records. He showed us how my grandparents had systematically protected their assets, putting them into trusts that were nearly impossible for my parents to challenge. He showed us medical certifications, signed by multiple doctors within the last year, all confirming my grandparents' full mental clarity and competence. They had thought of everything. They had built a fortress around me, brick by brick, document by document. They had assembled an army to stand with me, and I hadn't even known it. As I sat there listening, absorbing the full scale of my family's decades-long betrayal, I felt the last of my fear burn away, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. They weren't just greedy, they were cruel. They had leeched off the 2 kindest people I knew, all while holding them in contempt. Just then, my phone buzzed on the table. The sound made us all jump. I looked down at the screen. It was a text message from Jason. My heart pounded as I read it aloud. "We're coming tomorrow at 10. Don't try to stop us." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. It was another ultimatum, another attempt to intimidate me, to bully me into submission. They thought they were coming to confront the same timid, quiet girl they had kicked out of her apartment. They had no idea who and what was waiting for them. Matthew Goldstein looked around the table at our small group. He looked at Carlos's quiet strength, Dorothy's fierce loyalty, Rose's sharp intelligence, and George's calm preparedness. Then he looked at me. "Well," he said with a grim smile, "let them come." The next morning, the house was filled with a quiet electric tension. It wasn't the chaotic, fearful energy I had felt my whole life around my parents. This was different. It was the calm before a storm, but we were the storm. By 9 o'clock, everyone was assembled. Carlos and Dorothy were in the kitchen, making a fresh pot of coffee, their presence a silent, steadying force. Rosa and George were at the dining room table, their files and documents laid out in neat, damning piles. Matthew stood by the large window in the living room, watching the street. At 9:30, 2 more cars pulled into the driveway. Out of the first stepped a tall, silver-haired man with a commanding presence. "Judge Robert Henderson," Matthew said, introducing him to me. "Bob was one of your grandfather's oldest friends. They played chess together every Thursday." The judge shook my hand, his grip firm. "Your grandparents were wonderful people, Anna. I'm happy to be here for them." He wasn't here in any official capacity, but his mere presence carried an immense weight of authority. From the second car came a woman in a crisp police uniform, her expression serious and professional. "This is Police Chief Maria Williams," Matthew said. "She and your grandmother served on the town council together for years." Chief Williams gave me a firm nod. "Your grandmother was a force of nature, kid. Let's make sure her wishes are respected." Like the judge, she was here as a friend, but her uniform sent a clear, unmistakable message. Matthew gave them a quick briefing, outlining the situation and the evidence we had. As he spoke, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I looked around the room at these people, my grandparents' army. They were here not for money or power, but out of love and respect for the 2 people who had touched their lives. I was not alone. I was standing on a foundation of integrity that my grandparents had built over a lifetime. At exactly 10 a.m., a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. My father, my mother, and my brother got out. They were dressed in what I privately called their battle clothes, expensive designer outfits meant to project power and intimidate. My father wore a tailored suit, my mother a severe-looking dress, and Jason a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly salary. They walked up the driveway with an air of arrogant purpose, expecting to find me alone and terrified. Matthew opened the front door before they could even knock. "Richard, Diane, Jason, please come in." The sight that greeted them stopped them dead in their tracks. Their confident smirks faltered as they saw the living room was full of people. They saw the handyman and the housekeeper. They saw the business partner and the financial advisor. And then their eyes landed on Judge Henderson and Chief Williams. The color drained from my mother's face. My father's jaw tightened. This was not the ambush they had planned. "What is all this?" my father demanded, trying to regain control. His voice was loud, but it had a tremor of uncertainty. He pointed a finger at me. "Anna, I knew you were manipulative, but this is a new low. Gathering all these people to try and pressure us?" I didn't say a word. I just stood there, calm and quiet, and let Matthew take the lead. "There's no pressure here, Richard," Matthew said smoothly, gesturing for them to sit on the sofa opposite everyone else. They sat down stiffly, looking like defendants in a courtroom. "Just a conversation. We felt it was important for everyone to be here to clear up a few misunderstandings." My father started to bluster. "The only misunderstanding is in that ridiculous will. My parents were old and confused, and this girl," he spat the word, "took advantage of them." "Let's address that first, shall we?" Matthew said, nodding to Judge Henderson. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. "Richard, I had dinner with your father 5 days before he passed away. We played 2 rounds of chess. He beat me, as he always did. We discussed politics, the stock market, and his plans for a new community garden project. To suggest he was not of sound mind is not only false, it's an insult to his memory. I also have here," he lifted a folder, "notarized affidavits from 3 different doctors, all of whom examined both of your parents in the last 6 months, confirming they were in full possession of their mental faculties." My mother's face was pale. "But they were old. She must have told them lies about us." "What kind of lies?" Matthew asked softly. He turned on a small monitor he had set up on the coffee table. "Lies like this?" He pressed play. The security footage filled the screen. My mother's sharp intake of breath was audible as she saw herself in her black funeral dress, standing in this very room, stealing my grandmother's jewelry from the safe. Jason stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. My father looked like he had been punched in the gut. That's been doctored, my mother stammered, her hands fluttering nervously. The timestamp is authenticated, Diane, Chief Williams said, her voice flat and cold. And we can easily have the items appraised and checked against your homeowner's insurance policy. I imagine they're not listed there. My mother fell silent, her face crumbling. And Richard, Matthew continued, turning his attention to my father. You claim Anna poisoned them against you. But the truth is, you've been poisoning that well yourself for years. Rosa Martinez stood up. Richard, 5 years ago, Harold co-signed a $200,000 business loan to save you from bankruptcy. You promised to pay it back within 2 years. She placed a stack of papers on the table. Here is the loan agreement, and here are the bank statements showing it was never repaid. In fact, you leveraged your father's good name to secure other lines of credit, all of which are now at risk. You didn't just take their money, you jeopardized their entire company. My father stared at the document speechless. His carefully constructed image of the successful businessman was being dismantled in front of his eyes. Throughout all of this, I had remained silent, watching them, watching their masks of outrage and entitlement crack and fall away, revealing the ugly, desperate greed beneath. Their threats were gone. Their power was gone. All they had left were their lies, and those had just been burned to the ground. Finally, my father looked at me. His eyes were full of a hatred so pure it was almost breathtaking. You did this, he whispered. You turned them all against us. I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent room. It was steady. It was strong. You did this to yourselves, I said, looking each of them in the eye. You were so busy waiting for them to die that you never once appreciated that they were alive. You didn't want their love. You wanted their bank account. You saw them as an obstacle. I saw them as my whole world. I stood up and walked toward them. They flinched as if I were going to strike them. You didn't lose money today, I said, the words coming clear and true. You lost your masks. There's nothing left to hide behind. You didn't lose an inheritance. You lost the last tiny piece of your own family that was willing to see any good in you. The waiting is over now. Please leave. There was nothing left to say. My father's rage died in the suffocating silence. My mother was openly weeping, not out of remorse but out of defeat. Jason just stared at the floor, a picture of pathetic, spoiled entitlement. Defeated, they stood up and walked out of the house. They didn't look back. As the door closed behind them, a profound quiet settled over the room. The battle was over, and for the first time in my life I had won. The silence that followed their departure was heavy, but clean. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a fever breaks. The tension that had been a constant companion my entire life had finally vanished. I looked around the room at the faces of my grandparents' army, my army, and felt a wave of gratitude so immense it almost brought me to my knees. Judge Henderson gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. Dorothy handed me a cup of tea, her hand warm and steady on mine. No one said much. They didn't have to. We had stood together, and we had protected the legacy of two good people. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal paperwork and difficult decisions. But for the first time, I wasn't navigating them alone. Matthew handled the complex legalities of the estate, shielding me from the petty, spiteful letters that came from my parents' lawyers. George Patel sat with me for hours, patiently explaining the finances, translating complex spreadsheets into simple terms. Rosa Martinez began mentoring me, teaching me the ins and outs of Foster Logistics, not because I was going to run it, but because she felt I deserved to understand the incredible company my grandfather had built. One day, George and I were going over the final asset valuations. The numbers on the page were staggering, almost comical. They didn't feel real. I was still Anna, the kindergarten teacher who bought her clothes on sale and worried about her car breaking down. The idea of possessing this much wealth felt alien, like I was wearing someone else's clothes. What do I even do with all of this? I asked him, gesturing to the papers. George smiled. Your grandparents had an idea about that, he said. He pulled out another folder, one I hadn't seen before. It was a proposal, an idea they had been working on before they died. They wanted to start a charitable foundation. As I read their notes, my heart swelled. Their vision was so clear, so them. They wanted to help underprivileged kids in Ohio. They had outlined plans for educational scholarships, for funding school art and music programs, for ensuring every child in the district had warm coats in the winter and enough food to eat. It wasn't about a grand gesture or getting their name on a building. It was about small, meaningful acts of kindness that could change a child's life. That was the moment I found my purpose. The money wasn't a burden or a prize. It was a tool. It was a chance to continue my grandparents' work on a scale I had never imagined. We founded the Harold and Elizabeth Foster Foundation within 3 months. I dedicated an initial $10 million to its mission. Our first act was to partner with my own school district. We created a fund that teachers could access directly, no red tape, for classroom supplies. No more teachers paying for pencils and notebooks out of their own pockets. Our next project was to build a brand new state-of-the-art playground for the elementary school in the poorest part of town. I kept teaching. My parents had called my job a hobby for women without ambition, but they were wrong. It was my passion. It grounded me. The money changed nothing and everything. I still showed up to my classroom every morning with a smile. I still got down on the floor to build block towers and read stories. But now, when a student came to school with worn-out shoes, I could quietly make a call and have a new pair delivered to their home. When I saw a child had a real talent for art, the foundation could provide them with private lessons. My wealth wasn't for me. It was for them. It was a continuation of my grandparents' love, passed on to the children who needed it most. I moved into my grandparents' house permanently. It was too big for one person, but it was never empty. It stopped being just a house and became a home, a community hub. Carlos was still there every week, not as a handyman anymore, but as a friend, helping me tend to my grandmother's garden. Dorothy came by twice a week, not to clean, but to have coffee and gossip and teach me how to bake her famous apple pie. Every Sunday, the big oak table in the kitchen was filled with people. Matthew, George, Rosa, Carlos, Dorothy, and a rotating cast of local teachers and community members would gather for dinner. We would eat and laugh and argue about politics and share stories. These dinners were everything my childhood family dinners were not. They were warm, chaotic, and filled with genuine affection. There were no lectures on appearances, no pressure to perform. It was just a group of people who cared about each other, breaking bread together. One evening, sitting on the porch swing my grandfather had built, watching the fireflies begin to glow under the big oak tree, I realized the truth. My parents' final cruel act hadn't left me orphaned. It had set me free, free from their judgment, free from their conditional love, free from the crushing weight of constantly trying to be good enough for people who would never see me. I hadn't lost a family. I had found one. It wasn't a family bound by blood, but one bound by choice, by loyalty, and by a shared love for the two people who had taught us all what it meant to be truly rich. My grandparents left me more than $26 million. That's the number that gets all the attention, the part that sounds like a fairy tale. But the money was the smallest part of my inheritance. They left me proof that kindness wins, even when greed screams louder. They left me a community of good people who believe in loyalty and love. They left me a purpose, to continue their legacy of looking out for others. That's the true inheritance. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever had to stand up for what's right, even when it was scary and you felt all alone, hit like, subscribe, and tell me your story in the comments below. I read them because family isn't who shares your blood. It's who stands beside you when it costs something. And true wealth isn't what you keep, it's what you give away.